Hello, coaches, and thanks for joining me for this portion of the USA Volleyball coaching series about training, organization, and delivery. I'm going to take the next 30 minutes or so to guide you through a systematic approach to creating a richer learning and performance environment by using a simple process that you can deploy immediately. And although there may be some tools and techniques that may be new to you, certainly the key to the success of this system is really in its consistently applied use. Just as you would expect from your athletes, if you do these simple things very well, you will achieve a more consistent level of performance. So let's start this discussion with a simple maxim that, while obvious on its face, is sometimes forgotten by leaders in all professional domains. And that maxim is this: players play the game. Everything that we do as coaches, administrators, service providers, parents, clubs, universities, national governing bodies, national Olympic committees, is to prepare the athletes to perform on the field of play under any condition. This means that we have to intentionally think about leadership in perhaps different ways in which we create independence, ways in which we challenge, ways that demand curiosity and creativity, and ways that demand adaptability and resilience. Team sports, certainly like volleyball, provides a really interesting view into the interaction of individual athletes in a complex environment in which the team needs to organically figure out how to optimize performance in the face of uncertainty, especially when the leader, or in this case the coach, is unable to provide substantial input. Now, what you see in front of you is a really interesting quote. Actually, it's a description of the learning agenda of a secondary school in Rochdale, England, in the UK. And this is a school that's outside of Manchester. And what they've done here really is encapsulate what I've just described. And this is how they described their learning agenda. In other words, why they were doing what they were doing, how their teaching methodology was setting up their students to be successful once they left the classroom. So as you can see, they say effective learners will be happy and successful in life because they are self-dependent and can adapt to demanding situations. They will know what to do when they don't know what to do. So if this is the way that we want to develop our talent, what does this approach demand of us as the leader, as the coach? What kind of learning environment will allow these outcomes to develop? So as you contemplate that for a second, let me just tell you a brief story and provide a little bit of data that demonstrates this impact. One of the things that we've been looking at rather closely within the Olympic Committee and certainly within national governing bodies is in asking this question about creating a more rich learning and performance environment. We've done some pretty simple studies that, again, are not new, but get to the heart of this question. And that question is, in your training environment, how much time is being spent on active learning, skill development, and competitive preparation within each session? Likewise, how much time is being spent on passive knowledge delivery, static feedback, and inactivity? And the reason for asking this question is to actually start to look at time on task. How much of the available time are we using to create the kind of learning and performance environment that is going to deliver the outcomes that we desire? So if I were to show you a little bit of data This is actually data from one of the teams that I've had the pleasure to work with over the last several years. And to answer this question, before we asked it of the coaches, we simply went out to the training environments and with a stopwatch and a notebook, and we started to actually do a time on task analysis for every session that they did over the course of a 1-week period. And we tallied up the information and we created the pictures that you see here. The first pie graph shows how much time was actually spent in activity, how much time was spent in inactivity. So you can see for this particular team, for this particular week, on average, they were spending about 64% of their allocated practice time actually doing active work. 36% of it was actually done with inactive activities, if you will, that weren't contributing to the overall objectives of the training session. And if we were to further break that down into activities where we were doing warm-ups or transitions or giving instruction or simply time lost within the session, you'll see that really 51% of the remaining 64% of the total activity time was actually done in meaningful work. And so if you do the math, what that would suggest is for a 90-minute session, on average, this team was doing about 46 minutes of real work. So that's quite a bit of time lost, quite a bit of opportunity lost, but I don't think it's very atypical. And so when we went out and asked the coaches, what was your perception of how much time you were using in activity versus inactivity? Quite often the answer that the coaches gave was between 85 and 90% of their total practice time was spent in activity. And when presented with this evidence, clearly it was a bit shocking. It was difficult to comprehend, but at the same time provided a great opportunity to start talking about how training sessions were being organized, how were they being delivered, how efficient were they, but certainly how effective were they. And so using this information, we started to look at alternative methodologies, or maybe not alternative methodologies, but looking back at simple methodologies and creating a systematic approach to ensure that we were maximizing the time that we had available while minimizing the time and disruption to that time for creating an optimal or ideal training situation. So how do we go about doing that? You'll see here the title of this slide is called Procedural Standardization, but this is not a process that exists solely in the world of sports. We started to look at industries that utilized checklists. And checklists are used in a variety of industries, high-risk industries for sure, like commercial aviation, like nuclear energy, like medicine, military weapon systems, space flight, and the like. But what they do is provide a sense of structure and order and assurance that all of the critical elements that need to be done in this environment are done not only at the right time, but in the proper way. And so if we look at two of those examples, and you can see on your screen there's two examples here from the world of medicine and the world of commercial aviation, you'll notice that these checklists are designed in a very specific way in which they are delineated by specific phases. So you'll see in the surgery checklist there's actually 3 major phases that the checklist covers. Before the induction of anesthesia, before the incision, and before the patient leaves the operating room. On the commercial aviation checklist that you can see blocks of tasks that are also delineated there for a specific phase of flight. So they are designed in a very specific way to bring together all of the critical tasks that need to be done for a specific phase, and they do so in a very specific way by utilizing a technique called challenge and response, so that it ensures that everybody involved in the process goes through each step of the checklist and verifies that positions or techniques or processes are done in the appropriate manner. The way to think about this, and it's described in a paper that was put out by the journal, scientific journal Human Factors, all the way back in 1993, when there was a lot of work that was being done in the commercial aviation industry around checklists. You can see how they describe the major function of a checklist, in this case in commercial aviation. And they said that it is to ensure that the crew will properly configure the airplane for any given segment of flight, and it forms the basis of procedural standardization in the cockpit. So taking those concepts and looking at what we were trying to do in terms of standardizing or providing a framework for training to be organized, training to be created, and to be delivered, we started to put those thoughts of the checklist into practical use with coaching. So here is what our checklist started to look like. And again, shouldn't be too surprising, but we took the process of training, organization, and delivery and broke it down into 3 critical phases. All of the things that we do before training, before we go out to the field of play. The second phase would be all of the things that we do during the training session. And the third phase would be all the things that we need to do after training has completed. And to use a simple mantra, it became plan, do, and review. So each phase had a number of tasks that had to be done that we just simply called deliverables, pre, training, and post. And the idea for this is to create a learning loop. So the pre-training deliverables inform what will be done during the training session. The training session deliverables will then inform how we conduct a post-training review, and the post-training review will then be used to inform the next training session. This is the learning loop that we talk about. And so if we instituted this for each and every training session, every session would be an opportunity for us to get better at doing what we do. And really the whole point of this is to ultimately develop a sense of athlete and team ownership. Back to the very first slide that I talked about with players playing the game. If this becomes our standard operating procedure, if this becomes the manner in which we deliver training every single day, the athletes come to expect that, the athletes come to embrace that, and oftentimes with many of the teams that we've worked with, the athletes then take ownership of the process and begin to be critical players in this learning loop. Not only are they learning to perform as an athlete, but they are also learning critical skills in terms of peer-to-peer feedback, peer-to-coach feedback, training design, training theory, and helping coaches design training systems that are going to further challenge their capabilities, which is exactly what we want. As you recall, and as you know, certain times in the match, we can't necessarily call timeout. We do have the ability to call timeouts in volleyball. We also have technical timeouts that we can utilize. But oftentimes, there are times when the team has to come together and figure out situations. They have to take the picture in front of them. They have to take the trends. They have to take a look at strategic interventions. They have to look at how they're technically playing. They have to look to each other to find solutions. Not only do they have to find solutions, they now have to communicate those solutions to each and every person on the team, and do so after each and every point. So in order for them to be able to do that, we have to create a system that encourages that every single day. That becomes the norm. That becomes the behavior that we're looking to. Everything cannot be the responsibility of the coach to answer. And so our responsibility really is to coach ourselves out of a job. It's to create a clone of us out on the floor. And so by doing this kind of systematic approach, we can include the athletes in the process. We can help create systems that are going to be challenging for them. And ultimately, we're going to create independent, capable athletes who can figure out the challenges that exist before them. So let's look now at these phases in a little bit more detail. So again, the plan phase is the phase that occurs before you actually walk out onto the field of play. This is where you're going to organize and prepare the learning and performance environment. And so the first two items that we look at, you'll see, are to establish the learning themes for that particular session. You'll notice I put a little caution sign there beside establishing the learning themes, and that's for a very simple reason. All too often, coaches start to plan their sessions with activities first. What are we going to do during today's training session? What kind of activities do we need to do? I would suggest that before we get to that point, the question that we need to answer is, what is the theme that we are building this training session around? What are the critical big rocks, if you will? What are the critical themes that are going to serve as the foundation for today's training session? You'll also see that there will be a section here where we insert, or we review and insert, previous learning from training sessions that have occurred in the past. So if we're revisiting a particular theme, there should be some learning that we have accrued over a period of time that can help to inform how we are going to approach this theme for this practice session. More on that here in a second. So the learning themes, I would suggest we have about 1 to 3 central themes around which we will build the training session for the day. And again, these will be things, I've just put a couple of examples here, but perhaps we want to work on out of system setting. Perhaps we're talking about attacking through the middle, or we're going to work on skills on first contact. So first contact could mean serving, first contact could mean serve receive. Maybe we're going to do some work on block penetration or peer-to-peer feedback. You'll see that they can be technical themes, tactical themes, physical themes, perceptual themes, communication themes, whatever those themes happen to be. But these are the central things around which we were going to build the practice session, and keeping those small, clear, and concise really helps to organize the session. Once we've determined what those themes are, then we can start to create some behavioral alignment to those themes. So if we've created a theme, let's say for attacking through the middle, now we start to create outcomes. What are the specific training outcomes that we are going to deliver that support that theme for this particular session? As well as the outcomes we then have the opportunity to talk about the standards of execution. So, in talking about behavioral alignment and talking about training session outcomes, here's some guiding questions to help create those kinds of outcomes. The first and most obvious is, what are the athletes going to be able to do at the end of the session, at the end of the training session, that they were not able to do at the beginning? What kind of skill type are we working on? Are we going to have an outcome around a performance? Around a physical capability? Are we going to have an outcome around a technical capability, a skill element? Are we going to have an outcome around a tactical component or a visual skill? Are we going to build? What is the skill type that we're looking for? And a third guiding question would be, is the outcome a performance outcome? In other words, are we looking to measure against a performance standard? Or is it an outcome where we're really going to drive the opportunity to learn? So really the question or the statement that we have when we're building these outcomes is quite simple, and that is, at the end of the session, the athletes will be able to do, know, feel, or describe something at a particular level of proficiency. So here's an example. At the end of today's session, the athletes will be able to execute a float serve from zone 1 to zone 6 at 90% success rate, meaning they are successful 9 out of 10 attempts. That really creates clarity around what the outcome of the session is designed to deliver. It's easily measurable as to whether or not we achieve that outcome, and it helps us to define the activities that will allow for this outcome to be delivered. So you can see, before we've even gotten to the point where we're selecting activities, we've created themes, kind of these unifying principles for the session, and we've created session outcomes and performance standards that tell us exactly what we are going to deliver for the day. Once we get to that point, we can now start to select and design the training activities that will help to deliver the outcome. And again, here are some guiding questions that will help you select those activities. So again, the activities will be built around answering the question, what is the athlete's current level of performance and what is the desired level of performance? So answering that question will help us to determine what kind of activity is most appropriate for the current state of performance capability for the teams, as well as where we're trying to get to. A second question might be, why are we doing this activity in the first place, and what's its transferability into the game? So is there a specific reason why we're choosing this activity, and what is its value in terms of teaching a portion of the game? What is the context around which this activity is being designed? A third question might be, how many repetitions or how many opportunities are needed to actually achieve the outcomes that you desire? It may be that your serve target is 90% from one zone to another zone, but at this point your athletes are about 50% capable of achieving that outcome. How long is it going to get them, or how long is it going to take them? How many repetitions, how many opportunities is it going to take them to get to a 90% proficiency rate? So we have to think about how many times will we have to repeat a particular activity. Activities are usually designed from a very simple focus to a more complex focus as skills begin to increase. We also think about the kind of design of the activity we want to use. Is it a blocked design? Is it an interleaving design? Is it a random design? Moving from early skill development into actual game-like situations. What kind of contextual interference are we going to use in this kind of activity design? And lastly, a suggestion comes around this idea of naming activities, giving them very simple names so that you preserve the time necessary to explain the activity to your team. So rather than going to a particular activity and explaining its content over and over again, give activities that are typical in your gym or in your training environment a simple name. And so when it comes time for you to do that activity, you may only need to use 1 or 2 words as opposed to a lengthy description to let your athletes know what activity is coming up on the schedule. What you see after that, again, around this behavioral alignment, is clearly identifying the roles and responsibilities of everybody that is going to somehow touch this training activity. And so clearly defining what the roles of all of these individuals are in delivering this training. How can we maximize the utility of all of these individuals, from the head coach and the assistant coaches and position coaches, to the strength and conditioning coach, the medical staff, if you have video and statistician help, any other performance specialists, perhaps you have sports psychologists or things like that. Importantly, what are the roles and responsibilities of the athletes themselves? Who is going to be able to participate in these activities? Are there any performance limitations that we have to be aware of? And secondly, are there any injured or return to play athletes that we have to consider? How are they going to be engaged in this process? It's important that the athletes feel a part of the training environment. And so understanding that some athletes might not be able to participate in the training from a physical standpoint doesn't necessarily mean they cannot participate from a social support standpoint and from a learning standpoint. So clearly articulating how these athletes will be active and what their roles and responsibilities are. You may choose to use a return to play athlete to give specific feedback to their positional counterparts. You may use them to operate video cameras. You may have them doing their return to play activities on the side of the court so they can continue to be part of the team community. If you have any volunteers or spectators or media presence, what are their roles and responsibilities as well? What are the instructions? What are the things that every other individual on the staff needs to know about those individuals? So what this does is it clearly delineates the responsibility not only of the overall execution and delivery of the training session, but also for each one of the activities. So if the head coach chooses to take a standoff global approach to looking at training as a whole, and the position coaches are doing ball insertion, they're doing positional feedback, etc., it's clearly delineated up front so that everybody knows exactly how this is going to be deployed. And the last thing in terms of the planning phase then is actually putting together this plan, and if there are any scripts that you want to follow in terms of how this plan will unfold as you execute it. Now keep in mind, all of this is being done before we actually go out onto the field of play. The last piece of the planning phase now is actually checking for understanding. Does everybody understand the plan? Does everybody know their role? Has everybody been appropriately briefed? So this is where we have the opportunity to have a coaching and support staff briefing. Again, it doesn't have to be a long and in-depth briefing. Maybe it's only 5 minutes in duration, but with everybody having the training plan in script in hand, you can then review the training plan with all the coaches and support staff to make sure everybody understands exactly how things are going to roll, what their particular roles and responsibilities are, answer any questions that need to be done. Then we go out and we actually set up the training environment that is going to best support that training plan. So is all the equipment in place? Are the nets secured at the appropriate height? Are all the balls in position? Is there a whiteboard that's in place? Do you have your video equipment set up? Do you have your scoring mechanism set up? Do you have your recovery beverages and medical equipment in place? Is it all orderly and neat, and there's not anything around the court that could provide interruption of not only the process but come into be a risk to the field of play? Once that's all done, then it comes time to brief the athletes on exactly what they should expect. Again, this will be a global briefing. This will not be in depth, but this will just simply review the big picture for the training session that's going to unfold. This could happen on the court 5 minutes or so before the session starts in front of a whiteboard, for example. It could happen in a team room if you're so lucky to have a team room where you can review this in detail before it can happen in a locker room. It can happen anywhere before the athletes get out on the field of play to give them an opportunity to review exactly what's going to occur. And then the last thing we have here is a training rehearsal as needed. Many of you will have new athletes that come into the gym. Many of you will be utilizing perhaps activities or drills that you haven't used in the past. So rather than waiting until you get into the practice session and having to take a lot of time to explain how the activity will unfold, we suggest using time before training to actually do a bit of a walkthrough. So if there's somebody who's never been in the gym before, who is now going in with a gym full of veteran athletes who understand terminology, who understand drill rotations, etc., and this athlete does not, rather than creating anxiety in that athlete, what we suggest is simply taking the time on the front end to rehearse that session, make sure they understand where they need to position themselves, how the ball rotations will work, how the line rotations will work if that's the case, so that they can focus on their performance and not necessarily on whether or not they are following the direction or having questions around what they're supposed to be doing. So training rehearsals can be very, very effective to make sure that everybody is set to execute a really good flowing practice session. So all of this will happen before we get out onto the field of play. And so what this might look like on a whiteboard is something like this, where you've got some basic information down, you've got your 1 to 3 themes, you've got perhaps 3 or 4 outcomes that are designed, you've got your schedule of activities with performance standards for each one of those activities, and maybe there's some opportunity for scorekeeping, maybe you've got some pictures that help to explain some of the activities, maybe you've got your rotational schemes up there as well. But anyway, this provides a great general picture of the training session and giving everybody involved a really good global overview of what is going to be unfolding for the next 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours, however long that session may be. And so to give a real world example of this, this is a whiteboard from some time ago from Karch and the women's national team gym. And you can see that there's a lot of similarities to my hypothetical whiteboard as you see on this real whiteboard. And so you can see all of the elements that I've talked about, from themes and outcomes to activities with performance standards. You see some visual representation, you see scorekeeping, you see roles and responsibilities outlined there, and you also see some social accountability for individual points of focus, where there's a section on the right hand side of the whiteboard that says my focus this week. It is a way to publicly advertise for each player as well as for coaches what is the one thing they're going to be focusing on for that particular week. And so everything that you see here is setting up the environment to be a very rich environment, a high quality learning environment where everybody understands exactly what they need to do to execute that particular session. And so now it's time to move from the planning phase into the do phase. And this is where you get to do the great things to be a great coach. And again, the reason why I say be present and be a great coach is that some of the mistakes that we've seen, some of the shortcomings that we've seen over time have been where coaches have kind of been distracted by their lack of planning a little bit, and not been present in what's happening on the field of play because they're thinking about what they need to be doing next. It's almost as if they're planning and executing at the same time. If we go through the process of the planning phase and do it in a comprehensive way, we now know that everybody has a very clear understanding of what's expected of them. And so now for each one of the activities, you as a coach can be present and you can actually deliver on the training that needs to be done. You don't need to worry about what's happening next because you've already got that planned. If you need to make adjustments, you can do it because you know exactly what the theme of the session is, you know the outcomes that you're trying to deliver, and you can adjust based on achieving those ends. Without doing that substantial planning phase, oftentimes the training sessions become a little bit chaotic. This is where we lose a lot of time with a lot of explanation, a lot of unnecessary communication. And so By doing this planning phase, we're now ready to execute a session that is going to be efficient, effective, and rich in learning and performance. So you can see bookending this do phase really is this notion of beginning and ending at a designated start and finishing time. And again, this is really creating habits. This is creating habits to link this to competition. As you go to competition, very rarely do the competition organizers delay the start of a match because a particular team is not ready. We want to get teams ready to perform at designated times, so that whenever we're preparing them for competition, they're ready to go at the designated time for the competition and ready to adapt if things should somehow need to be adjusted to. So beginning the session with a designated start time, or beginning at that designated start time, is important. If you have to push the finish time, be sure to communicate your reasons why. It might be that our outcomes haven't been met yet and we want to continue to push until we meet those outcomes. It might be that there's some communication that needs to be done to create some understanding. But if you need to push the finish time, I would suggest that there's very clear communication as to why the designated finish time is not happening. But those two things are really, really important to start to set expectations for the individuals and team. The learning loop that happens in the do phase, you can see, is pretty simple, and that is that you brief the activity before you start it, you execute the activity, and then you debrief it to finish it. Again, this gets into the habit of very small, very short opportunities to, again, ensure that the athletes understand specifically why the activity is being done, what the outcomes that we're trying to do on the activity are, and to make sure that there are no questions before we start. So this training activity brief can be anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute and a half. It's very short, it's very clear, it's very concise, but again, it's making sure the athletes understand exactly what it is that we're trying to do during this activity. Then the activity is executed, and there's some things, again, that we think about as we're executing this activity. How many repetitions will this activity deliver, not only for the team, but for every individual? And how much time on task will this activity give us? So if we think about doing an activity for about 15 minutes in duration, how many total repetitions will that give us? And is that enough to deliver on the outcomes? Might we have to redesign the activity a little bit to maximize or to get more repetitions or time on task? The second guiding question here is the kind of feedback that we're going to be giving. Who is going to give the feedback, and of what type, and of what frequency? So are we going to deliver feedback on every repetition? Are we going to give feedback on a block of repetitions? Are we going to give feedback only when the standard of performance is outside of the standards that we've set? We call that bandwidth feedback. So there's a lot of different ways to give feedback. There's a lot of different frequencies of feedback, and clearly there's a lot of different people who can give feedback. So think about, how are we going to deliver that during the session? The third point about activity execution is around questioning. How are we going to engage the athletes with directed, open-ended questions to, again, help them learn, rather than giving them answers and giving them feedback after every repetition, asking them how things felt. Did you achieve it? What helped you achieve that successful outcome? What could you do differently to get a successful outcome? What are the things that you're thinking about before ball contact? What are your eyes looking at before ball contact? What were some of the things that we talked about in this particular skill? So there's a lot of opportunities for questioning there, and again, directed, open-ended questions as opposed to the yes, no, closed type of questions are kind of better for learning and better for engagement. And then lastly, in activities, the kinds of progressions that we're going to use. How are we going to advance from one type of skill training to the next? How are we going to move from basic training to more advanced training with contextual interference and constraints? How are we going to use constraints to our advantage, whether they're time constraints or space constraints or environmental constraints? And then how might we introduce chaos and challenge into the training session where these skills are not only tested, but tested to extraordinary measures, giving them challenges and problems to solve that we don't necessarily give them the answers to. This is going to help with a lot of creativity. So those are the kinds of things that we think about when we're executing the activities. And then what's really, really important at the end of each activity is an opportunity to come back together again and debrief that activity. Again, this doesn't have to be long. It can be 30 seconds to a minute and a half, 2 minutes. But it is critical that there's a point at which we get input from the athletes in terms of what was their experience. It also gives us the opportunity to determine whether or not we achieve the outcomes that we desired to achieve at the beginning of the activity. This also allows for athletes to give peer-to-peer feedback as well as peer-to-coach feedback. And this is another great opportunity for coaches to use targeted questioning to elicit feedback and insight from athletes. Once that debrief is over, we now move on to the next activity and the process repeats itself. If that was the last activity, then we finish at the designated start time and we move into the next phase of training. One thing I will say too is that the whiteboard becomes a great place to brief and debrief after every activity. So as you have a whiteboard at your training session, for every activity you come to that whiteboard. You have, obviously at the beginning of training, you have this global overview of what's going to happen. But then prior to each activity, you come to the whiteboard, you do about a 30-second to a 1 minute or minute and a half brief about each particular activity. You go out and execute that activity, and then you come back to the whiteboard to debrief the activity before you move on to the next activity. So it becomes a central meeting place for you to come in and out of training and to make a very clear bookend to the start and the end of each activity. Finally, we get to the review phase, and this is where we're going to capture all the learning and close that learning loop. So once your training session is over, what's really important at this point is to debrief the team and debrief the staff to capture all of the observations and learning that you've witnessed over the course of the training. So you can see here the first item is to debrief the team on the field of play. So immediately after that last activity is done and the training session has come to an end, it's worthwhile to go over a very short but very quick debrief around how the training session went from the athlete's perspective. And again, you can use very simple 3 and 4 question models to help guide that discussion. So you can do things as simple as, what do you think went well? What do you think didn't go so well? Why do you think things didn't go so well? And what was your number one takeaway from today's session? That can be a very simple debriefing tool. But the point is, we want to gather feedback from the athletes in terms of what was their experience and what did they learn, so that it helps to inform us as to whether or not the session was as productive and as meaningful for the athletes as we thought it was going to be. The second part of that, once the athletes disperse and that debriefing is over, and again, that debriefing can be 5 minutes long. It doesn't have to be long at all. It would be really good to get the performance staff together and do a debriefing as well. And this is where we can look at what we intended to do with the training plan and what actually happened. So a nice 4-question model for the coaching staff would be, what was our plan? What actually happened during the training session? What caused the difference between the plan and what actually happened? And then how are we going to make adjustments moving forward? So this is really a check on the process. Was the process successful in delivering a really good training environment, one that was rich in learning and rich in experience? It's going to inform us, and again, we want to capture all that learning because that is then going to inform the next training session that we do. The last item you see there below the line really is your opportunity to have much more in-depth conversations with individual players or the team. So this can be something like an individual performance video review. This can be a team meeting. This can be a video session. This can be a number of different things away from the immediacy of a training session. So this is when you've had the opportunity to maybe have a rest. This may be later on after a session, after you're doing a little bit more in depth and some of the statistical evidence comes back, some of the video evidence comes back, you've had an opportunity to review some things, and now you want to go into deeper detail. That's where this particular item in the review phase comes from. So again, the idea here is that we're creating this learning loop where we're doing work before training to set up the environment to have really good learning and really good performance. We're doing some things within the training itself to make sure we're considering skill progression, contextual interference, introducing chaos, introducing competitive situations, introducing opposition research, doing things that help drive performance in a particular direction. And then once we're done with that, we're collecting review. We're actually collecting feedback, learning that will then be used to inform the next session. And again, the whole idea here is to create athlete and team ownership, a consistency of performance. Again, this is not a very exotic, complex system, but its value comes in the repetition of doing this session in and session out, day in and day out. It is doing small things really, really well and seeing the compounding effect of doing that simplicity every single day. It's doing simple and doing it better. So again, thanks for the opportunity to briefly talk about this concept of training, organization, and delivery. I certainly hope that this has been a helpful discussion and that you'll be able to utilize these tools in your environment in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. So all the best to you and your team. I wish you all the success, and thanks for your time.